Seems to me the beginning of wisdom in this business is to acknowledge that both good and bad things will happen as a result of cannabis legalization. So there's a gain in personal liberty, there's a gain in welfare, consumer welfare, for those cannabis users who do not have a drug problem. The disadvantage of cannabis legalization comes in the increase in the number of people who do have a drug problem.
How the government chooses to regulate the industry will decide the future of cannabis legalization.
It's no longer a question of whether marijuana is going to be legal in many parts of the United States. It's a question of how it's going to be regulated, taxed, controlled, if at all.
This is not a dispute about whether there will be a market for marijuana or whether there won't be. It's a question of whether we want a black market with all the evils that entails, the violence, the criminality, or a legal market where it can be regulated, it can be taxed, people can go to court to settle their disputes instead of settling them on the street with guns. So yes, that money, rather than flowing out of the U.S. economy and into drug cartels around the world or into illicit organizations within the United States, that money now can go into the economy. Colorado puts a lot of their marijuana revenues in the education budget.
Now people are also noticing the amount of money that is being raised in these states, which is also a driver for legalization.
The controversial debate on regulation ranges from complete government monopoly to free market ideology. In addition, the legalization of the previous states caused a significant alteration in the perception of marijuana legalization.
Starting with California in 1996, several states have authorized the cultivation, distribution, possession, and use of marijuana for medical purposes under state law. In 2012, voters in Colorado and Washington approved initiatives legalizing marijuana use under state law and establishing state regulatory systems for marijuana use. In 2010, the Council of the District of Columbia authorized the use of marijuana for medical purposes, and following congressional review of that legislation, it became law in the District of Columbia.
Legalization in Colorado and Washington were very important because before then, people had no idea what marijuana legalization would look like. In the absence of an example, the assumptions were usually way more dramatic than the reality. After the laws passed in those states, the public saw that the sky didn't fall, people didn't quit their jobs and smoke marijuana all day, young people didn't increase their use, and people were not on the roadways crashing their cars.
There's good evidence that it lowers property crime, lowers violent crime, and that's just marijuana. We're not even talking about the legalization of other drugs, which would multiply that impact. As I mentioned before, it's raised a lot of revenue for other functions in the state. It's kept a lot of money in the local economy that previously was being sent out of the economy and out of the country. And perhaps its most important contribution is it hasn't been the disaster that everyone said it was going to be.
Currently, 23 states have legalized marijuana in some form, whether for medicinal use or for complete recreational discretion.
As we looked at the next 11 states, they have several things in common. In many cases, you already have legislation for legalizing marijuana within the legislative process. In most of these states, having a small amount of marijuana is just a misdemeanor. The last one is that most of these states already have medical marijuana use.
Proponents of this action still have to account for roadblocks when calling for complete legalization of marijuana.
Especially in the Republican Party, there are different factions. So you have this kind of Bible Belt mentality in the Republican Party that there is still like a Puritan streak there that is opposed morally to drug use and thinks the government has a role or even an obligation to enforce morality in society.
Look at the way people get used and move on to other drugs when they use marijuana as a gateway drug. It's not them that are the only victims. Their families are the victims too. Their children are the victims too. And their employers are the victims also. And that's why I'll enforce the federal law, while you can still put an emphasis on rehabilitation, which we've done.
In my view, the time is long overdue for us to take marijuana off of the federal government's list of outlawed drugs. In my view, at a time when Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, and the District of Columbia have already legalized the personal use of marijuana, every state in this country should have the right to regulate marijuana the same way that state and local laws now govern sales of alcohol and tobacco.
Support for the legalization of marijuana has been steadily increasing according to Gallup polls spanning from 1969 to the present year. So why is there still debate surrounding the argument of marijuana legalization?
The big roadblocks are getting the political machinery on the same level as the electorate itself, and also you have groups that exist. You have a lot of interest, a lot of special interest arrayed against legalization.
The DEA, for instance, is a steadfast opponent to calls for the legalization of marijuana, and this agency, along with its mission, is supported by Congress.